thank you very much for the opportunity to be here in Northwood. And let me just give you a few more details about my background, as well as a little bit on my involvement with the Manchester schools, because I did have a brief role there. But let me tell you about the relevant parts of my background. I am now a retired professor from the University of Arkansas, although what I've been doing in the last 2 years would not seem like anybody's retirement, as I have been traveling around the country testifying to state legislatures and other groups that are trying to find out more about Common Core, since they knew almost nothing about it at the time that their state board of education adopted it. I was also, about a dozen years ago, at the Massachusetts Department of Education, where I was a senior associate commissioner in charge of developing or revising all of our state standards in K-12 and all major subjects. I also revised all of our teacher licensing regulations and teacher licensure tests and criteria for professional development. So the whole ball of wax, as it turned out to be. And then I was on Common Core's validation committee from 2009 to 10, where I had an opportunity to interact with the people who actually did the writing of the standards. I focused on English language arts and reading because my background is in reading research from the Harvard Graduate School of Education, reading instruction and reading research. And I became a very close friend at that time of Professor James Milgram, who was the only mathematician on the Common Core Validation Committee. He was from Stanford University. And we were 2 of the 5 people who refused to sign off on Common Core's English and math standards because in our own independent opinions, we did not feel that they were internationally benchmarked, that they were not research-based, and that they were not rigorous. He looked at math, I looked at ELA, and since then we have been going around together testifying in many states around the country that invite us, and neither of us charges for our own testimony because we feel it's a public service that needs to be done by people who know the math and the ELA standards well. What I'm going to bounce off for the most part is something called Common Core Facts, and eventually you'll be able to find this on the website. Apparently we could not get use of the copier tonight in order to make copies for all of you here, but it is available on the Pioneer Institute website and on my own homepage at the University of Arkansas, which is easy to access simply by Googling Sandra Stotsky, Arkansas, and it's the first item that pops up. But I'd like to begin with something like this because it's never clear what a different kind of audience knows or has as background information about Common Core. Before I get into it, let me say that I will also be outside in the hall afterwards to entertain any questions that people might have or some more specific details that I won't have time to do here in my talk directly to all of you. And while I may not be able to hear the person from the Manchester School Board, let me say that I did speak about a year ago to Mayor Gatsis because I had volunteered, as had Professor Milgram, to evaluate whatever standards were being developed because he told me when I spoke to him on the phone that he wanted standards that used Common Core as the floor, and that he wanted very good standards. And I did go several times to talk to teachers who were developing the standards under David Ryan, someone in charge of assessment with the Manchester schools, during the spring of a year ago. And when the standards had been finished and brought to the attention of the school board, I was asked by a school board member to come and give my judgment of them, and I said I would do so if I could receive a complete copy of all the standards, and if there was an indication of which standards were above the floor that Mayor Gax's had asked for. I never received a complete copy of the standards, never mind an indication of which ones were above the floor. So I never did get to Manchester to a meeting of the school board to talk about what was in their standards and what wasn't in their standards. But somehow this got translated by someone in the media to indicate that Stotsky had unreasonable demands. And all I had asked for was a complete copy of the standards with an indication of what was above the floor. So I just want to clarify that in advance. Common Core facts, and unfortunately what is in Manchester to a large extent may simply be what we have in Indiana and in many other states that think they have gone through the process of revising their standards, but they end up with something that is Common Core warmed over. Where did they come from? They came from 3 private organizations in Washington, D.C. They weren't developed by the states. They were developed by National Governors Association, Council of Chief State School Officers, and Achieve Incorporated. And they were all funded by the Gates Foundation, Bill and Linda Gates Foundation, for this purpose. And the Gates Foundation, as you probably know, has spent a great deal of money disseminating and promoting Common Core, even though hardly anyone 6 years ago in any state legislature had any idea what they were all about, which is why Professor Milgram and I have gone around to so many states testifying and telling them what Common Core standards were, because they had no idea what their own state board had voted for and what the costs were going to be for the infrastructure for the testing. I do understand that in New Hampshire some of you might be able to develop local assessments that meet certain criteria, so it may not be possible for me to answer detailed questions about what is happening with testing. Originally, Smart Balance was to be your Common Core-based test. Whatever test you do adopt will have to be based on Common Core because they are the official standards of your state board. Let me go briefly into who were the members of the groups that developed the standards. Remember, I was on the validation committee, and the only people we interacted with were each other and with the people who were running the standards project from these private organizations. We never met anyone from the State Department of Education. We also were required to sign a confidentiality agreement, and I want to mention that because I have long been a very active member of my own community, Brookline, and I grew up in an open town meeting form of government. I had never signed a confidentiality agreement before, but we were not allowed to talk about anything that happened in the validation committee at the time or for the rest of our lives if we wanted to be on the validation committee. This was a rather bizarre experience for me, but that was the name of the game. So we signed if we wanted to be on the validation committee. I can't tell you about what happened on the committee. I can only talk to you about the results that are available and public information. The people who developed the standards, and I've written at great length about this, and you can find it in my published testimony that is available on my website and many other places. None of the ones in English were qualified to write English language arts standards. They did not have a degree in English. They had not taught English. I speak specifically of David Coleman and Susan Pimentel, because having been involved in Massachusetts with the development of English language arts standards, one of my greatest concerns was to make sure that high school English teachers had a very large say in the standards we developed in Massachusetts, and they did. They also developed the criteria that we used for the items that would appear on the state test called MCAS. This was not the case with Common Core. In fact, on the standards development work groups, people who were absent visibly were high school English and math teachers. And I commented on that. English professors were absent, scientists, engineers were absent, parents, state legislators, early childhood educators who have all written, by the way, early childhood educators developed a petition about the developmentally inappropriate standards in Common Core in the K-3 grades. And there are no records of the meetings of our validation committee because that was forbidden by the confidentiality agreement. We don't know who asked for the standards writers, why they were chosen, how much they were paid, because none of that information is available from the private organizations that developed Common Core. Very different from state standards where you know what teachers were involved, how much it cost you, what they were paid. None of this information is available for Common Core. As I mentioned earlier, I was on the validation committee, and we were supposed to evaluate soundness, rigor, validity of the standards as they were being developed. My experience was that we had no say whatsoever. All we were expected to do was sign off at the end that the standards were first-rate, wonderful, fine. And that was why Professor Milgram and I and 3 others chose not to sign off. He was the only mathematician and I was the only person with experience developing English language arts standards on the validation committee. So the purpose was not achieved. How do these Common Core standards compare to what you had in New Hampshire? And I know New Hampshire's ELA standards well because I used to review all state standards. Actually, your own standards earlier had many strengths because they had content indicated to a large extent in them. What are the major flaws with Common Core's ELA standards? And that is why the problems are now showing up in the tests, by the way. Let me just briefly indicate, because I've written in great detail, the problems with Common Core's English language arts standards. They are skills, not standards. A skill is something that you apply at every level. You can apply it to the 3 Little Pigs. You can apply it to Moby Dick. A standard indicates content. And one of the best ones we had in Massachusetts, put there by our English teachers, and New Hampshire would probably has qualified no different at the time, was that in grades 9 and 10, students were to become familiar with the themes, structure, and components of classical Greek drama and epic poetry. Now that might seem rather esoteric. However, this is what our English teachers wanted, and what it meant was that students would read the Iliad, the Odyssey, or the Aeneid, something that was common in grade 9 and 10 years ago. That was what they meant by standard, and that was what we had in Massachusetts, which meant that for test items, you would choose a passage from something, one of those works or something comparable, and it was the expectation that students should be able to read high school level material when they were in high school. That was the basic assumption behind Massachusetts and your old New Hampshire standards, that when students got to high school, they should be able to read high school level material. I come from training in readability. That's why I pay attention to level of materials as well as other aspects of the content. And this is one of the problems I am seeing as I look at PARC tests and Smarter Balance tests. And all I can talk about are the released items, because one of the difficulties we have in talking about either PARCC, which is the test that we use in Massachusetts, Smarter Balance, the test used here in New New Hampshire and in many other states, is that all we have are released items. We will, or examples of items. We will never see what is actually in the computer to understand what students are being evaluated by or with. Why I find that to be particularly troublesome was because in Massachusetts we had a marvelous Education Reform Act I administered. And one of the statutes explicitly required yearly release of all items that were used on state tests. That meant every year, parents, teachers, anybody could see what their kids were being evaluated by. You can't do that anymore with hot or smart balance. It's all in a computer. And these are copyrighted standards that were developed by private organizations. They're not under any law that says they must be released. So you will have no opportunity to see varied test items that are going to be used not only to judge college readiness in grade 11, which is the really high-stakes test of all of them, but they are eventually, if not sooner, to be used to evaluate your teachers. That was part of the Race to the Top agreement, that test results would be used to evaluate teachers. A certain percentage in every state chose a different percentage. I don't know what New Hampshire's agreement is. Some states went up to 50%, some 10%, some others just left it open to be adjusted and worked out and compromised eventually when the test results were available. But regardless of those important uses of test results for the grade 11 determination of college readiness, which means students can take credit-bearing courses at the state college that they get into, or that the results will be used to evaluate teachers in part, depending upon the agreement. Regardless of those two uses, which are very important, you will have no way of judging the validity of their usefulness because you will never be able to see the entire range of items used. And I stress that as being important because, as I mentioned, I'm an old readability person. I studied under Utah and learned all about readability formulas and beginning reading research. And you have to be able to see all of the items at a grade level to judge overall readability level. Some of them will be easier, some will be harder, most of them should be right on the grade level you want. And at the high school level, most of them should have a high school level of reading. Otherwise, what does it mean to have a student graduating from a high school and they're not ready to read adult materials? They're certainly not college ready, even if they have passed a test that says they're college ready. So that is all related to the question of content-free skills that are featured in your English language arts standards that are Common Core based, if not Common Core pure. You also have another issue to consider, and I say this from also having been a teacher many years ago, both at the elementary and high school level. Common Core standards expect a lot more writing than reading. Let me ask people here, how many of you have children in the schools, K-12? Put it down for you. How many of you are elected or appointed officials? So there's another group. And some of you are both parents and people who are elected or appointed officials. You have a double responsibility. But the focus on writing, I will very arbitrarily say, is misplaced, because anyone who has been a teacher in the schools knows that reading is the basis for achievement in any area, K-12. And if students can't read well, then all the writing in the world isn't going to make them better readers. Better writers come from being better readers. We know that from 100 years of reading research, that the best writers were always very good readers. And so if you have teachers spending a great deal of time on writing in the classroom, especially in the early grades where these childhood educators have said it's inappropriate to stress essay writing in grade 2 and 3, and yet that's what they're being asked to teach or to do, you're spending a great deal of time on something that is developmentally inappropriate at that grade level that might be much better developed at a much higher level. But that's the nature of the test, whether it's SBAC or PARC, and that may be what you have to do to satisfy these standards. There will be many questions, I'm sure, that you will have about these standards. Those two are probably the two most important ones to be concerned about. The third I'm going to mention because it has become, let me say, rather controversial across the entire country, and that is the focus on something called informational text. I happen to, as I told you, come from the field of reading, and this was something I tried to speak to both David Coleman and Susan Pimentel about. Where did this come from? Middle of the night, someone's brainstorm. I called up reading researchers. Do we have anything at all to back up the notion that students will be better ready for college if they do in their English class more informational reading? There isn't anything to back it up. Not a thing. We're not talking about reading in history or reading in science. We're talking about informational reading in the English class in place of complex literary text. What is at risk is the development of critical thinking. It does not come from reading informational material. It comes from reading critical or complex literary texts. And I ask you to think about how you have learned to think critically when you were in high school, even with a simple poem. Your English teacher had to teach you how to read between the lines of Shakespeare, even a simple Wordsworth poem. And I've seen this done with a group of 80 English teachers. It was like throwing red meat out to them. How would you talk about or explain or get your kids to interpret that famous line in the Wordsworth poem that begins, "My heart leaps up when I see the rainbow in the sky"? There is a wonderful line in this very short poem that says, "The child and his father to the man." What does it mean? English teachers love things like that. You have to understand that's their red meat. They can spend a lot of time trying to help students figure out how you interpret the meaning of that famous line. That's what they've been trained to do. And learning to read between the lines is the basis for getting kids to learn how to do analytical reading and thinking. And then the critical thinking is when you start involving lots of independent reading beyond the context of whatever it is that we're looking at. And if you have a peculiar pedagogy, which I just want to mention briefly, that is being promoted by Common Core supporters, which says you want kids to do cold reading or decontextualized, non-contextualized reading, they're not going to be able to do critical thinking. Whatever they do, it's not critical thinking. Critical thinking, and I've done a lot of it because I was a town meeting member for 10 years in my hometown, means bringing a lot of stuff together from the outside, from the context, from history, from culture, from wherever, to bring to bear on whatever the issue or question is. And if kids are being told to try to confine yourself to what is in the text alone, you do not end up with critical thinking, you end up with some other kind of thinking. If you're confined to whatever is in the text. Now, I would be happy to entertain for as many minutes as as I say, I would be happy to do this outside in the hall as well later. But if you have short questions, let me answer them as best as I can. You can see these back pages later on because they will be copies of them. Anyone with quick questions? I can fill up hours or fill out like a recording. Go ahead.
Put down the question.
If you can stand up and speak loudly, that's fine.
Microphone.
Again, when you come to the microphone, could you please state your name and your address, please?
You know, I know the routine.
It's right on the top.
Sandra Stotsky, welcome here.
I can't hear you, I'm sorry.
I say, welcome here.
Oh, thank you.
My name is Joseph McCaffrey. I live in Northwood. I'm not known for quick questions, so I would like to hear you. This entire. I've spoken to our school board a number of times, trying to alert them to be concerned. I've gotten, I'm sorry to say, rather dull responses. I'm going to be frank from everybody at the school district. Some interest. I mean, there's and obviously our superintendent has enabled this to take place tonight. I actually think there should be more of it, quite frankly.
Can you give a quick question?
Yes, the quick question would be, I would like to just, could you address just the monolithic nature of what I hear is being imposed as a nationwide theoretical experiment? And that's all I hear. And I am troubled greatly that anybody who's interested in this data mining and all the problems.
Right, there are other issues of which I can't even go into data mining because that's a topic.
No, but I'm saying, I'm just bringing it up as an analogy to the fact that we're hearing about the incredible secrecy that this is being foisted on the American school system. And I find it stunning that people are willing to go along with what they are ignorant of.
Let me just ask as possible illustration. Is this the first or one of many meetings you have had here in Northwood on Common Core? And just quickly, is this the first or one of many? First. And here it is 6 years after your state board voted it in. That is a good part of the problem. There should have been 6 years preparing people for this vast experiment, which it is, because no one, as I say, even knew who the standard writers were. You have a question?
Yeah. Now, the question was, I had one on
Could you say your address to this?
Oh, sure. The Long Road. My question is, data mining is too much time, it's going to go to. My question was, American history AP class. How has it changed because of
So that, I'm going to have to say, is not strictly a Common Core issue. It's an issue. It's a big issue. But Common Core is basically ELA, English Language Arts, and math. And it does have literacy standards for teaching the other subjects. But the AP U.S. History comes from the college boards, and David Coleman is now, with the help of Gates Foundation money, the president of the college boards. And you would have to have a meeting devoted to the teaching of U.S. history, which I would strongly recommend, to start getting at the issues with history teaching, because history teachers are very concerned about the literacy standards in a document called English Language Arts that tells history teachers that they should not be contextualizing what they study in history. And every history teacher knows that the first thing to do with a document, primary source document, is contextualize it. Gettysburg Address, who wrote it, why did it get written, where was it written, for what purpose? You don't bring in context. And yet, David Coleman is on record as saying that he wants to level the playing field, which means you assume equal ignorance on the part of all students and don't allow outside information. So I urge you in Northwood to ask for a meeting devoted to history and U.S. history. I'm sorry, that's the best I can do here. It's a wonderful question, but it's just not a common core specific question.
We're starting to run out of time. Any final words, Dr. Stotsky?
I would be happy to talk to anyone who would like answers to other questions outside after I listen to Heather, whom I have not had a chance to meet formally. I believe you are Heather Gage from the Hampshire Department of Education. So I'm going to listen to Heather, and then afterwards I will be happy to meet people outside in the hall who want to know a little bit more about Common Core that I can bring to the discussion. Thank you. Move out to the hall.
Marvelous. Well, I want to tell you that I actually saw an interview that was done through HSLDA. They published something. Yes, because I have been a homeschooler, but I am also an educator. So I guess my question for you is, well, at what point in your process for this, were you ever concerned when they asked you or told you this was completely, you can't discuss it with anybody ever for all eternity?
What is your question?
My question is, at what point did you say to yourself, maybe this isn't right?
I knew it wasn't right at the very beginning because I didn't have the right people developing standards. I didn't need to sign a confidentiality agreement to know that that was wrong. I mean, I've been participating. I was on a library board in Brookline, a town meeting member. I've been on umpteen selectmen committees. I've never signed a confidentiality agreement. But these were private organizations. This was never a public process. That's the basic problem. I wanted a public process because I know what a public process is like. I know what sunshine laws are like. There was nothing similar, but if I wanted to be on the validation committee, I had to sign. Milgram had the same issue. You want to be on the committee, you got to sign. So we were willing.
So you were not thinking that there was anything nefarious going on?
Yeah, I did. I said that before then.
You did?
Yes, we signed in September, but in June when they came out with the first list of people on the committees, and I couldn't see any academic content experts on either committee, I said there's something wrong. These are not the people I would put on a committee to develop standards.
Now, when you walked away,
there's an agenda behind it.
When you
I
walked
knew that right away.
Did you immediately go on a speaking tour to try and make people familiar with what was
Milgram
going
and
on?
I posted our critiques. He had a 13-page critique in math.
But of course, none of us
on-
knew what was happening, so none of us knew.
Well, because you've been lied to for 6 years. Come on, this has been part of the problem.
Right. So
I put my critique, I handed it out to my Board of Ed. I was on the State Board of Ed in Massachusetts. My 2-page critique I handed out to everyone else. I gave it to the Commissioner of Education. They did nothing about it. They didn't care. Milgram posted his 13-page critique on his own website at Stanford. He knows mathematicians.
You said it's still up there?
Yeah, it's available in if you just write Milgram critique of Common Core math, it'll be picked up in any number of places. But after about a year, we began going around because state legislatures began to say, what are these standards our State Board of Ed adopted? They didn't tell us about it. So they would ask him for the math and me for the English because we both are experts in different areas.
So let me ask you, as an expert, how do you think this is going to work out for schools who choose not to adopt the Common Core standard. Yet, the SATs and the ACTs are all being rewritten to align.
They're
with
going to
Common
go
Core.
with Common Core, just like Manchester is.
Yeah. So there's no way around, is what you're saying.
If they want federal money, if you want federal
and that
money,
was the question.
go where the money is going to, that's part of the problem.
And I felt like that was kind of
and that's what Duncan is doing with the state of Oregon right now, this week.
Yeah.
They're trying to vote. This is a progressive state, known as a progressive state. The legislature is voting this week on whether it will allow kids to opt out of a state-mandated test. It wants to do that because it's also a local control and autonomy issue in most Western states.
Sure.
And Duncan said you won't get your federal money.
So what she said was completely opposite.
Well, that is the problem, yes. She's speaking for the Department of Education and the governor, who have a different agenda. And that is why people have to look outside of the talking points to find out what's happening. Duncan spills the beans all the time. He can't shut his mouth up. I mean, his problem is Oregon says we want to pass a law doing X, and he says you won't get any money from us if you do that. And then the next day he'll say this is a state-led process.
Oh, brother.
I mean,
really?
come on. But you won't get your federal money if you do
But
something
you know what?
we
You
don't
need people like that. You need. I mean, he may be working for the other side, but you got to know the truth.
Well,
you got to know the truth.
Well, no, he's not telling the truth. She's pointing out he does it by mistake, by assertion of his
Right.
authority.
That's why I'm saying keep him talking. We got to know the
No,
truth.
but he
one way or
won't
the
talk
other.
all the time. He will say the wrong things.
Okay.
And
So
you don't know what he's really needing.
What she just told you, you didn't know that truth. The point is the press is not picking up on
No, I know.
But the media doesn't pick this up. You don't hear. Fox News doesn't tell you that. It's all the media.
Yeah, I know.
I heard what the little clip was this past Sunday on Fox News about the park test. They had an
Oh, I saw that.
I
saw that.
I know, and I know what they're dealing with because I testified a week and a half ago at Bridgewater State University.
Yeah.
We're having post hoc public hearings in Massachusetts. This is what gets me. They already made a decision last year to adopt park, and now they're having public hearings on the board's vote for park. I have Superintendent Lupini is in the Brookline Public Schools, my hometown.
Yeah.
He's got a big letter to the Brookline School Committee on his website from June 14 saying, next year the state's moving to park. He's chairman of the state superintendents. He knows what he's talking about. As of 2014, the state is moving to park. They're now holding 5 public hearings to get input from the citizens on the official vote by the Board of Ed this fall on whether to vote for park.
It's already done.
But it's already done. It's already
So
done.
I said to them when I was there testifying, I said, this is a sham process. You couldn't do this in town meeting. I mean, no one would vote easily, you know. We voted last year to do X, but this year we're going to vote officially to approve the decision that we made last year. You can't do it that way in town meeting. But this is what they're playing with. So I go around like just speaking the truth. This is what's happening. And does the media report? No. You
New
know,
England town meetings are the purest form of democracy in a republic. I should emphasize because it's worthless as a democracy purely. But it's the purest form, and we're essentially abandoning it as we kind of have.
yes, well, they're getting rid of local control and local responsibility. And if ESEA passes in 2 weeks, the Elementary, Secondary, and Education Act, which is Senator Lamar Alexander, Senator Patty Murray, Washington State, they have decided that reauthorization language for NCLB, No Child Left Behind, which is ESEA, because that comes from 1965, Lyndon Johnson, sorry. War on Poverty, I've looked into all of this.
Yeah.
But they've got a reauthorization that basically says all power will be in Heather's hands. No more in local schools. All power will be in the State Department of Ed. They will choose your standards if you want Title I money.
That's the big
And
catch.
that's my issue.
Do you want Title I money?
No, not me.
No. I mean, is there any state that's going to say, we don't want Title I money, that's only for low-income kids? Because she doesn't think she's lying. She's only repeating talking points that her
So she hasn't actually done her homework.
I made a remark during this meeting, based on what Dr. Stotsky said, but based on a lot of just listening, and listening to David Coleman, who's the Gruber, the John Gruber
I know.
of education,
Now he's at
who is
SAT, I know.
he's a Machiavellian mouthpiece. He knows exactly what he's up to, and if you hear his clear statements, he said, which I didn't quote here tonight, that you said about these assessments. This is he said that the entire structure of the way they design Common Core will win. It is. He said it was inevitable. I think he
because it's
referred
got
to
the
it
power of
as a law.
fluidity and Title I
Well,
money.
and it's got all the money from
but
Bill Gates.
it's not just
But
that. The
ESEA
design
in 2 weeks is
designed
going to
succeed.
seal the whole game.
So I have a question.
No, wait, you've got to understand, in 2 weeks, Congress puts the whole game over because they have declared, Congress passes a law, it's like the Supreme Court decision every day, it's over with. If Congress passes a law in 2 weeks that says, if you want Title I money, your State Department must submit state standards that they have approved. No one else, only the State Department.
And notice the way she put that. You can get, if it's approved by an institution in your state, like UNH, what do you think they're going to approve? What do you think they're in line with?
They want
Or
state
another
appropriations
school
money.
Of
system.
course. It's all about the money.
Well, that's the whole point, but she isn't saying that.
Yeah.
I mean, you've got to, okay, let's have any other
I'm going to
questions.
ask a question at the audience here.
No, I've got to get a question. You've got to give me a question.
Okay, my question is for homeschoolers like myself,
Yeah,
and we have
okay.
been homeschooling for many
Okay.
years. How does that affect our children? Who
At
need to
college,
be
at college, you are going to have to ask your what is it called, the legal defense fund,
Yeah.
what they're trying to do because they know what's happening with the ESEA. And they're worried about SATs. If they require an SAT that David Coleman is aligned to Common Core, then homeschooling parents will have to decide, do they give a Common Core curriculum to their kids in order to get them to pass, or do you get your own state universities to say, we don't require any.
Go to Hillsdale College.
Right. If I can afford it.
Well, you can
No.
if you are in that problem. They have ways to provide.
There's another solution, and I say this to state legislatures everywhere, and I don't know where your state reps are. You develop your own matriculation test. Every state develops their own. Forget about grade 11 college readiness test. You have all your state faculty get together. This is what European countries, many of them, not all, but many of them do. A matriculation test is a college admission test.
Right.
Okay.
Finland has one.
Yes,
Proving
they
that
do.
you have fulfilled a certain realm of studies in order to move on.
It's an admissions test to get into your state college or university system. And you have different
for the state.
performance levels. So if you do it at the highest level, you get into your top university. If it's at a middle level, a state college, a lower level, a community college, whatever. However they want to structure it. But they have performance levels for each state made up of their own.
This is for the state institutions as opposed to just
The private.
Harvard or any other.
Harvard and Stanford are letting in foreign students to pay full tuition. They will do what they want to do. And as Jim Milgram says, because he teaches at Stanford, they will not lower their standards. They don't need to. MIT, Harvard, CIT, Stanford, they will just get kids from Southeast Asia who
To hell with the Americans.
yeah, and so what happens is at the graduate level in math, they do not have one American student. This is true in engineering programs all over this country.
I've sat at a few graduations
No American students in graduate engineering programs. They all come from different countries abroad.
India, China.
Well, Middle East doesn't matter. Their best students come, they pay their way, and our engineering colleges have graduate student courses that are filled. It's just that they can't get American students at the undergraduate level. Even even though they're trying to get girls to go to engineering school, but they can't even get enough girls to finish. I mean, if you finish Common Core Standards, you've gone to weak Algebra 2. Any engineering college for at least 70 years expects trigonometry at the high school level in order to get into an engineering college.
Calculus is a remember.
What?
Calculus, differential calculus.
Well, that they will teach you at the college level, but you at least had to go through trig. When I went to high school, you had to at least go through trig if you wanted to get into an engineering college. At any engineering college, it didn't matter what one was. I'm not talking about MIT. You've got to have calculus in order to get into MIT.
Yeah.
But any dinky engineering college requires at least trig, something beyond Algebra 2.
Yes.
And you've got to have teachers who can teach, by the way, beyond Algebra 2, which is another issue, because our teacher training institutions also know what side of the bread is buttered on. They're going to have state appropriations, and you better teach to only Common Core Standards. Don't go beyond them. How can you require anything more than Algebra 2? So who is Northwood Academy going to be hiring in 5 years when its current math and science faculty retire? Only people who have gone up through Algebra 2. That's it. And they won't be able to teach anyone how to become an engineer because there's no one who will even understand trade. I mean, this is a long-term process over generations, and that's what they're counting on. No one will see all the damage right away. It takes a little while for you.
And they'll be too dumb to figure it out later. Let me ask you a question, which you said, because you had a lot to do with Massachusetts. I don't know, the education, not just at Brooklyn, but the, what do I say, Department of Education, state education.
It's all of the state standards and licensure tests.
And my understanding was, Pioneer Institute, I think, has backed this up, but I've heard you refer to this too, that the Massachusetts was maybe first in the nation in a number of categories, especially in language arts.
Well, both math and ELA. Since 2005, because it takes a few years for this stuff to sink in, we were first place on NAEP, National Assessment of Educational Progress, grade 4 and grade 8, math and reading, for the next 5 tests.
And as they've implemented Common Core, my understanding is it's beginning to degrade.
The reading test in grade 4 results are beginning to go down. We're still tops, but we're only maybe a point or two above the next. We used to be way above.
And are you being measured, and that measurement was taken, is it measured against other Common Core states, perhaps?
Oh, every state has to participate.
Because that, in other words, dropping down somewhat,
yes,
a little,
it's
whatever.
Against all
if you're measured
states.
against others dropping down, you're actually dropping faster than
that
you might otherwise
in
a real measure. And that's
the only independent test is TIMSS, which is Trends in International Math and Science Survey. We entered as a country, and Minnesota, a few other states entered as countries. It's independent of Gates Foundation. It's not under USED control. But the USED knows it's going to be a problem, so they want us to go with PISA, P-I-S-A. Programs for International Student Assessment comes out of a group of European countries. And it only assesses skills for 15-year-olds, grade 8. No other test. So that's going to show that we're now emphasizing the skills, and that's all they care about. And on the validation committee, we had Andrea Schleicher, who was the director of assessment. That was the first clue to me, because I was trying to figure out why was this Belgian citizen on our validation committee. And the reason was, of course, that he is in charge of assessment for PISA, and he wants to expand business in this country. So they're going to expand PISA's business and try to discourage states from applying independently to TIMSS because TIMSS is not in their control. So
TIMSS right now has the higher or better standard?
It assesses curriculum. And if you look at TIMSS, you will get Trends in International Math and Science Survey. It's changed what it stands for, but it's TIMSS, initials. And you'll see lots of stuff on it, but it doesn't come, it's like every 4 years. It's not every 2 years. But that is independent, and New Hampshire could enter as a separate country. It's the only way to know what's happening. It costs money, and that was one of the problems. Massachusetts entered in 2011, second time, and we had to rustle up some money to pay for registering as a separate country.
Maybe, and I'm going to, just one other little question related to that. How come Massachusetts, in your just brief idea, how come they took this, what I would think is an independent approach to education in defiance of pretty much the way they do everything else?
Right.
They don't do bridge building that way in Massachusetts. They don't do tunnel building that way in Massachusetts. So how did they?
Well, because Val Patrick became governor, and the idea was that we want to move the needle. He decided you have to move the needle on the bottom, for the bottom 30%. And Common Core was sold on the idea that it would make everybody college and career ready. So all of the guilty people in Massachusetts whose kids are doing better decided that they wanted to make sure that we would close the gap.
No, really what I was thinking was more how, because your input and others like you, how did you manage to raise Massachusetts in the earlier stages?
Because I had my stars aligned at that time. This was 1999 to 2003. Succession of Republican governors who didn't know much, but they trusted the people in the Department of Ed. David Driscoll, who was a Democrat, was a former Boston College graduate in philosophy and math. He was smart, and he knew this. He had been a former superintendent in Melrose. He knew the right math, and he also knew the right mathematicians in the country, and I made sure they were in touch with him. And he was pleased to speak to real mathematicians because he knew what they were. He had a good undergrad education. I also had a board composed of some very smart people. Board of Education. We had people with PhDs from University of Chicago, at least two of them.
But the bureaucrats went along with this. I'm saying.
No, I'm trying to say that I was there, appointed by David Driscoll to be in charge of the standards.
So you pretty much had
And
sway.
I had darts and arrows all the time, but I have a thick skin, doesn't bother me, I thrive on it. And I got all of these K-12 standards documents through because the governor was supporting. We had first Weld, then what the hell was his name? Salucci, and then Swift, and then Romney. We had a succession of governors, like one every 2 years.
They maintained consistency.
They maintained consistency because, first of all, we had the Massachusetts Education Act, which was bipartisan. Tom Birmingham, Mark Roosevelt, and William Weld, Republican and Democrats. And this, everybody agreed, was fine. Everybody liked it, business liked it. And there I was appointed by David to be in charge of all this stuff. And I wanted content first, which was fine with him. He was a BC grad, as I say, philosophy and math. And I wanted everybody to be raised, which was fine with everybody in Massachusetts.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. Was Sober there when you
He was only there for the first English one that I did in '95. I wasn't working at the time, but no, it was very important because I got the English going. That was how I got the job later on. But Silver wanted someone who wasn't going to give back the nonsense that was in his own school of education.
I've heard him criticize the school of education.
Yes. Well, I interacted with John Silver in '96 and '97 because I had been appointed to help get this first set of English standards through, because the draft that had come out from the first huge committee of educators had stupid nonsense like strands. What are the organizing strands of a document? And one of their organizing strands was strategies. That was all Silver had to see, and he said, we got to get rid of this committee. I mean, this is not a committee that even understands what literature is about. You don't organize literature by strategy.
No.
Another one was discussion. I mean, it was unbelievable. And I was allowed to appoint 6 people to this committee, and then the other side could appoint 6 people of the others. I had to take high blood pressure pills that year. I mean, I survived. But I got a document through, and John Silver came up to me and said, I don't know how you ever did it, but it was because I was taking it.
It's because of, look at you. You know what you're talking about.
Well, I also knew how to speak to John Silver, which was another issue. He would talk, anybody who knew John.
I didn't know him, I just heard, I've heard him.
Antonucci was the commissioner.
No nonsense.
And Antonucci didn't dare speak to him because as soon as he opened his mouth, it was like the crocodile's jaw, you know. So I was the only one who dared to come down. I'm that kind of a person. I inherited from my mother. You know, you just speak up and you don't care. And
gee, I don't know anybody like that.
But you do. But as this lady said, I recognize it really now. But you know the subject. See, and this is so often.
I was trained by Jean Charlotte Harvard
and the
research. And John appreciated that. I could tell him everything down to the last, year. Who was the scholar at the University of Texas where he was dean that had produced the best work on discourse analysis? I don't know if you know, that's your area, right? Canavy. What's his name? James Canavy.
Yes.
And I said, because we had a long argument, John Silver and I. He was very insistent that he wanted certain things in the document.
He ran for governor. Did you remember that?
Yeah, and he lost.
He was the one-armed governor.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, the would-be one-armed governor, I should say.
Yeah.
But boy, and he was not a politician. And he said what was on his mind, and he was very forceful about the way he did it, and he was a very smart guy. But unfortunately, that doesn't work in politics.
Well,
not in Massachusetts.
Everything he said was so funny that the press would report it. But it didn't win him the politicians.
Didn't do him any favors.
He didn't care. He was chancellor of BU. I mean, it didn't make any difference.
Yes.
It's just that he...
Can I bother you for a photograph with me?
Oh, with you.
If you don't mind?
That's fine.
Where's the down here at the bottom?
Someone to take it. And you are?
Kevin Verville. We met in Pepperell. I came and listened to you speak in Pepperell. I got the same article passed in Deerfield, New Hampshire, and with working with Marie, she got it passed here in Northwood. So my wife and kids came tonight to hear you as well.
Oh, okay.
So
you look a little familiar.
Thank
Okay.
you. Face only a mother could love.
I've got several.
Great. Thank you very
So
much.
check.
Thank you very much for coming. We really appreciate it. Thank you
Good
very
for
much.
you for all your work that you've done too.
No, please, anything.
I would have spoken more, I would have answered more questions if the format had been such.
Yeah,
But
they're
the
very
idea that
timely.
this is, in 6 years, the first forum in Northwood, I mean, I hope your legislators heard that.
I live in Stratford and we've not had one.
Well, that is to complain about. First in 6 years? What's wrong with these superintendents? What are they afraid of?
What are you afraid of?
They're afraid
The
of
other challenge
the
we have-
truth.
Oh, it's actually not the superintendent's, it's the school board's
Right,
responsibility.
and that's the challenge we have. None of these school boards have taken a vote to accept or reject Common Core. It's come in with the night fog,
Yep.
and no school board that I'm aware of in New Hampshire has taken a vote to accept the
Because
change of
these
standards.
superintendents get wined and dined, or they're told you won't get your state money.
That's exactly it.
Yeah.
I've been
even
speaking
though
out
there's
at my
no
school
way.
board for a couple of 2.5 years since I really. I am not. I am Stratford. I am not well liked in Stratford at all.
Superintendents have a different problem because I try to figure out why they were so silent. Teachers want to hold their jobs, so they don't open their mouths in local schools because this was a problem until recently. Now the unions are coming out speaking for teachers, so it's a little easier for teachers to speak up. But superintendents want to move on in a few years to the next place that won't hire them if they already have a reputation for being, against Common Core.
It's all self-interest, and that's the problem in this country right now. Everybody is all about self-interest. How is it going to benefit me instead of how is it going to benefit
they're
the
not
greater
going to be
public?
hired
Well,
if they're controversial. That's the thing. But
listen-
you see, I'm past all of
But
that.
look at you.
I don't care.
But the argument
But
that
no,
comes
they
from
can't
them.
hurt me. You see, Gates can't. All he can do is try to suppress me and shut me up. So the media won't report anything, or the newspapers won't report anything. Reporters will call me for leads, references, but they won't report anything I say. What can I do?
In some fashion, everybody does things for their own self-interest. Everybody does.
That's
But-
Adam Smith.
But, well, yes.
It's fine.
Yes, and
Well, it is.
it's human
Wealth
nature.
of Nations is
it's
fine.
human nature, but what we hear at school board meetings in the North is always the mantra, it's for the children. And that's a partial truth. It is for the children, yes. But whose children, under what circumstances, and have you really thought this through? Because if in a superficial way, I'm going to accuse Heather here, I think, and she wouldn't like that, but in a superficial way, if you think it is well-intended and good, but you haven't looked over to the next page, say, oh my God, look what they're going to do here. And then, but you've been on the first page, you read all the boilerplate here, and it says wonderful. Dr. Duke Pesta,
I know Duke.
Well, just to quote something, I saw a presentation, I don't know if you've seen him present stuff,
get it
but
on
he said
YouTube.
the teachers union in Washington State and Chicago
In
are
Wisconsin.
bailing out or want to bail out of the Common
Yeah.
Core. Now, this is a very different kind of self-interest. They see the rug being pulled out from underneath.
Well,
exactly-
they have been
again,
throwing
it's
their own
self-interest.
teachers under the bus, and I couldn't figure out. Tom Gosnell, who was AFT person in Massachusetts, the MFT, just testified, and you were the one that you have it on a YouTube video that he just came out with 2 nights ago in Lynn or something like that. He is saying, get rid of Common Core standards. Now, this is the guy who was head of the Massachusetts Federation of Teachers Union. So they're now able to speak out because nobody can touch them.
But the only reason why they're speaking out, it is not because of the children. It is because they don't want their evaluations based on the testing. Because the testing
That's all right
is
if you can get a common
I understand that.
alliance.
You're right.
For different reasons.
You're
You're not
right.
going to
But that
convince
was
them.
why these unions held on. Gates gave some money to both unions, AFT and NEA, 7 years ago, so that they would have an initial buy-in. But both of them forgot that it was their own members they were throwing under the bus.
Right.
And suddenly, 6 years later, they're hearing, because I met someone in Louisiana who was head of the state Association of Educators in Louisiana. He said, all the teachers I know in Louisiana can't stand Common Core, but they can't say a word. This is the South where they don't dare to speak up in their local schools. The only person who can speak is me, and we have to tell Dennis Ruckel, who is the guy in Washington who was in charge of the NEA, who one night came out and said Common Core is a train wreck. And he heard from all of these people, I was told by this Louisiana educator, so that the next morning he has to modify his remark because he didn't want to get his union members into trouble in all the states.
But Bobby Jindal has turned that whole
Well,
train
Jindal is a
around.
different story.
Yeah.
That's from the governor and his lawsuit.
Yeah.
But there are 2 lawsuits, one that's successful in Missouri that took place a few months ago. John Sauer is the lawyer and the law firm, and I forget where he's based, maybe St. Louis. But it was against Smarter Balance, and he got the state judge in Missouri, this was a decision a few weeks ago, you can Google it, to declare that Missouri's Department of Ed illegally paid dues to be part of Smarter Balance. Find out what your own state Department of Ed is paying for dues to be part of Smarter Balance. I don't know. Heather might know, but she probably would. It's someone else, Virginia Barry, maybe your governor. But in any event, John Sauer was pro bono lawyer who got the judge to agree that Missouri could no longer be a part of Smarter Balance because the membership dues were illegal. Now there's another state, and I forget whether it's not Wisconsin, I don't remember, but I just read about it this past week. North Dakota. Look, and they've hired John Sauer and his firm, and he's got a pro bono lawyer in the North Dakota legislature. They want to get out of Smarter Balance because they are also paying dues. And they're going to see whether they can. You've got to find the right grounds. That's part of the legal issue. You've got to get the right plaintiff, and you've got to get the right legal issue, and every state has different statutes. So the issue is then to find the right state statute. Because I spoke to John maybe a year and a half ago, because he was looking to see whether they could get students as plaintiffs. We've had right to learn lawsuits in Massachusetts, and you can find students who will claim that they have not had enough money appropriated by whatever it is, the city or the town, so it becomes a right to learn lawsuit. But the plaintiffs are students who have been damaged. by whatever. And John Sauer was trying to figure out if there was a way to claim that Common Core had damaged kids. Well, it hadn't been implemented, and we didn't have a test, so there was no ground.
They're asking us to leave.
So what he found was the membership dues. That was what they found. I'm just sorry to say, you got to find the right issues. The new state.
Denise Rainey from the background. Nice to meet you too.
Thanks very much.
My pleasure. But you are a smart, balanced state. Look into the dues issue. And then check with John Sauer,